Welcome to Raise the Line with Osmosis from Elsevier, seeking solutions with leading experts on how to increase healthcare capacity so people can get the care they need during the pandemic and beyond.
Hi everybody, I'm Michael Carrese. Today we're going to dive into the fascinating story of a very old technology, EEGs, being mined for data using a very new technology that's changing the way that patients are treated for disorders of the brain. With us to explain is Dr. Jake Donoghue, co-founder and CEO of Beacon Biosignals, a startup that applies artificial intelligence to EEGs to unlock precision medicine for neurological, psychiatric, and sleep disorders. Dr. Donoghue earned his MD from Harvard Medical School and PhD in neuroscience from MIT, leading research into the effects of neuroactive compounds on brain network activity. His published works span epilepsy, cognition, and machine learning methods for quantifying pharmacological effects on neural activity. And thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
It's going to be interesting to dive into this, but first we want to learn more about you and your background and what first got you interested in medicine.
Yeah, so a long journey, probably didn't fall too far from the tree with a mother that's a pediatric neurologist and a father that's a neuroscientist. So I think early days, very interested in the brain and the opportunities to take care of patients and seeing that the power of being able to take care of, groups of particular children with pediatric neurologic disorders and the impact you can make on their lives. I really stood through as I paved my path through my training at Brown and then at Harvard and MIT.
So once you were in med school, was there anything else that kind of confirmed that was the right direction for you? Did you consider other things?
I was in medical school, so I did my MD, PhD. So it was a long journey there. It was just a great opportunity to really dive deep and understand, in my particular instance, the neurophysiology and how that relates to cognition and the way that drugs affect brain activity. No, I think that that's the beauty of the MD PhD program in general, and at Harvard and MIT in particular, where they really allow you to think about the number one goal is having a big, harnessing, deep scientific insights to make an impact on patients. And this path provided an opportunity to make that impact.
Sure. I said at the beginning that EEGs are very old technology, I think about 100 years old. Could you give us kind of a grounding on what they are, what they do, before we figure out what you're doing with them?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so EEG, or electroencephalography, records the electrical potentials from the brain activity from the scalp. It is a 100-year-old technology. Really, the first rhythms discovered by Hans Berger, and the alpha rhythm at the posterior parts of the head. When you close your eyes, you can see this 10 hertz roughly rhythm appear in the back of the head. And so from these electrodes on the scalp, we're able to understand both disease processes and healthy brain activity by looking at how the electrical activity patterns change over time.
And give people an example of how that is typically used.
Yeah, so EEG is the sort of standard of care as a part of diagnosing epilepsy. So looking for epileptiform activity, such as seizures on EEG or epileptiform spikes that may be subclinical events. And also it's worth remembering that EEG is a standard part of the polysomnogram suite. So folks getting a PSG, as that's called, for diagnosing sleep disorders are also getting their brain activity monitored.
So here this is sitting out there for 100 years, and at some point you must have had an insight about applying newer technologies to maybe get more information out of those. So tell us about that and that kind of the backstory of how Beacon came about.
Yeah, so I think the beautiful thing about time series data in from the brain is it represents one-dimensional images, and so that what I was and all of us have been witnessing it through as part of taking care of patients, getting to see firsthand and just generally in the field how image classification and recognition tasks have really transformed the way we think about digital pathology, radiology, how we can take those tools and apply them to this data modality that where we record large quantities of data, don't have the tools to necessarily extract all the features of interest and understand their links to how patients feel, function, survive, and those underlying diagnoses. And so at Beacon, really spending my time thinking a lot about brain waves and how drug effects to brain activity happen during my training, became very clear that we could harness the same types of tools that were really making massive improvements in clinical workflows and driving forward precision biotechnologies in oncology and medicine in general, and thinking about a similarly heterogeneous space of psychiatric disease and neurologic disease where we have this physiologic activity that we've never really been able to go and understand the full depth and breadth of to really capture the disease heterogeneity. And so that's where Beacon emerged. We're realizing that we could apply these tools to these data sets and really understand the ways that we can drive forward precision medicine for the brain.
So you basically are training the AI on like the data set of a patient or a huge data set of patients?
Important question. Yeah. So machine learning, I'm sure everyone's aware now with large language models and ChatGPT, benefits from really large data sets for training that need to be diverse, heterogeneous, so that they can generalize to any patient. And so at Beacon, we have partnerships with academic medical centers and some of our EEG acquisition vendors, where we can aggregate over 50,000 EEGs and polysomnograms to be able to use that data to label it and train machine learning algorithms to identify features within those large recordings, as well as a consensus of experts. And so what we do there is we actually have multiple experts label, hundreds of thousands of examples, for example, epileptiform spikes. So we can have 8 epileptologists label hundreds of thousands of these individual sharp waves that last under 1 second. And we can train the model to guess what percentage of epileptologists would call this individual event an abnormal feature. So taking this consensus-based modeling, we're able to remove a lot of that inter-rater variability and produce robust, validated pipelines to be able to understand and run inference over very large recordings really quickly.
So I'm a patient and you get my scan and the AI is able to tell, based on this huge data set, maybe what I've got or what I don't got.
Yeah, I think two big examples that we like to use that stand out is, you can think about in the EEGs in some of these patients with developmental and epileptic encephalopathies, where the EEG recording may have hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of epileptiform spikes, depending on the duration of the recording. And so you can imagine in this indication where you start a new treatment in one of these children, and you'd want to know, is there a change in the background abnormal epileptiform activity? Well, there it's infeasible for a human to count the number of spikes that may be present or number of electrographic seizures. And so machine learning tools allow us to measure that burden quantitatively and see, maybe there was a 10 to 20% reduction in some of these events that may have huge implications for that kid's long-term behavioral, cognitive, motor development that really just get missed through the gestalt and sort of subjective terminology we use in our medical records to describe those features. On the converse, a patient may arrive with an individual spell and we'll get an EEG and there may, maybe may only be one event of potential suspicion. So, 20-minute recording where 1 second has an event that sort of caught the eye of the epileptologist. Well, that, if that person's a pilot or someone that drives their car, making that diagnosis based on that one sharp wave event, and of course, in context of the clinical symptoms, can have a huge impact for that person. So one way the machine learning tools here can be added is basically providing this expert consensus modeling so that you don't have an undercaller or an overcaller of abnormal events, reading that EEG and making a diagnosis that could transform that person's life, positively or negatively.
So as the provider, is it just sort of a confidence issue that, this is what I'm seeing, but I've got this Beacon information that's telling me that, yeah, I'm on the right track?
Yeah, so Beacon right now is really focused just on our biopharma partners. So we utilize our tools to bring quantitative endpoints into clinical trials. And so we're able to do things like measure every single epileptiform spike, subclinical seizure. In sleep, we can do automated sleep staging and count sleep microarchitecture events like spindles and arousals. And so these are the types of tools that we're validating in our clinical trial partners to help understand, target engagement, whether a new treatment is affecting brain activity and whether there might be certain responders to certain medications. It wouldn't, as we, obviously see patients meeting DSM-5 criteria for depression. Some patients may have hypersomnia, sleeping 22 hours a day, as some of the patients I remember seeing, versus insomnia, sleep just a few hours every night. So we're really thinking about what would it mean in these novel clinical trial settings to bring more quantitative insights that might define this 2 different classes of patients with depression in a data-driven way, and there probably are even more, to really understand which types of patients, what is their underlying sort of endophenotype and why certain groups may respond to certain treatments better. Again, this is mentality just that everyone sort of really thinks about in oncology that we think we can translate to the neurology and psychiatry space. longer term, we do see this opportunity to translate to the clinic where we can bring these tools to really improve individual patient care.
Gotcha. So you mentioned epilepsy and sleep, psychiatric disorders. Are there other clinical trial areas where this is particularly useful or effective?
Yeah, one big one is in Alzheimer's disease. And so there, some of our research we put out last year, building off of sort of a foundation put forth by a few groups over the last 5 years or so, is understanding why some patients with Alzheimer's disease have cognitive decline faster than other subgroups of patients with Alzheimer's disease. And so one area of research we were interested in is seeing, do patients with Alzheimer's have abnormal electrical activity patterns? And so we actually looked at our large data set, over 50,000 patients, to find the patients with Alzheimer's disease that had no comorbid epilepsy. And so they had no history of seizures, but we looked at their EEGs, and we actually found subtle hints of subclinical epileptiform activity. And so that had been seen a few times before, but never in a really large real-world data setting. And so this idea that there are potentially subgroups of patients that their hippocampus is involved in a particular way, where there's a hyperexcitability sort of feedback loop that might define a subgroup of patients that have faster cognitive decline and therefore may be better or worse responders to some of these novel Alzheimer's next generation therapies.
So in other words, if you have this tendency or whatever toward epileptic seizures, your Alzheimer's could progress more quickly.
That's what previous research has shown, and we've replicated elements of that.
That's terrific. Obviously pretty profound to be able to advance understanding of Alzheimer's, my goodness. And what else are you working on that you think that holds a lot of promise?
Yeah, well, I have to comment, at least the year of the zebra behind you, I think it is worth noting. We're really focused a lot in rare disease in developmental and epileptic encephalopathies. I think that there's tremendous unmet need there, where these, diseases that can range from a couple thousand patients to tens of thousands really are at the bleeding edge of needing next generation precision technologies. And there's a huge wave of antisense oligonucleotides, gene therapies emerging that really could have a huge impact for these patients. And one of the issues that we see is that in a lot of these, for these families and for these children, the way that we measure efficacy often relies on seizure diaries. And so where we ask the families to annotate in a paper or digital diary when they have a witnessed clinical seizure. So you can imagine the burden that puts on families, of course, and what's more, there are obvious events that are just unable to be witnessed. When the patient is sleeping and it's a subclinical event, there may be nothing to see, even if you're looking at your child, or if you, as the parent and caregiver, are sleeping and there's no one watching.
Yeah, you can't be there 24/7.
Exactly. And so, in addition, we think that capturing the underlying brain activity, almost of course has to represent the brain pathology of these, developmental and epileptic encephalopathies, and by definition, where the epileptic activity is probably driving some of the pathology. And so we think there's a really big opportunity where in clinical trials where seizure diaries are going to be fraught with inconsistencies and may miss the true underlying disease burden, and outcomes scores like patients in developmental and motor outcomes may take years to see the effect of, which is infeasible for a clinical trial setting, which needs to be done in months or a year. So we're really excited about, for these groups like SYNGAP1, KCNT1, Dravet syndrome, and others, where we can, as a platform, apply our tools to measure quantitative endpoints such as electrographic seizure burden, electrographic spike burden, and see maybe in really short order that these drugs are having a tremendous effect on brain activity and can help get these new therapies approved and into patients.
Oh, that'd be terrific. So as you may know, Osmosis is a teaching company, and one thing we love to ask our guests is to give us some direction about where we should focus some attention. We make educational videos, we develop courses, and so forth. So is there a topic that you're particularly interested in where you just think people don't get it? There's myths, there's gaps, there's something that should be understood that isn't right now?
Yeah, I think one area that really we should all spend more time thinking about is in sleep medicine, and how it actually applies to not just disorders like insomnia, narcolepsy, but how sleep is a fundamental part of the core pathophysiology we see in many diseases. Obviously in psychiatric disease, or it can be a part of, as we already talked about, in depression or PTSD, generalized anxiety disorder. So these are symptoms that may be actually linked to the core, underlying etiology. And similarly, we see sleep as a core factor in neurodegenerative disease, obviously, most prominently in disorders like Parkinson's disease, where patients have REM without atonia, but also even more subtle features we think we can pull out in diseases like Alzheimer's. So we think, there's a lot of opportunity in this, fundamental state that all, humans go through to actually bring quantitative insights to really map some of these, really robust features of brain activity to understanding disease and health.
I'll pass that along to our crew because that's a very interesting area to explore. So, a lot of the folks listening to this are either med students, nursing students, learners of other types, or early career professionals. And we always like our guests to provide their kind of go-to advice about getting through med school and approaching their career, particularly at this time when, on the one hand, everybody's been through this tremendous upheaval with the pandemic, and on the other hand, there's all these disruptive technologies like what you're working on coming through. Very kind of unsettled time, I think, for folks. So what's your advice about navigating all that?
Yeah, I'm only a few years out, but I think no matter what path you take to have an impact for patients, it's an arduous one. Takes a lot out of you and a lot of time, emotional energy. And so the most important thing is that you have to find what brings you the most joy and reward to know that you're having that impact, and whether that's being in the clinic, seeing patients, or thinking about how you want your impact to potentially be at a different scale or take a different form. I think at the end of the day, just figuring out what you love the most is really the most important thing.
And did you always think about becoming an entrepreneur and starting something, or was that unexpected?
Yeah, I think it was a bit unexpected. Although, I think I always had an interest in finding my own path and trying to have an impact on patients was really the driving narrative for me. But I think it actually, for Beacon in particular, seeing that there was this opportunity with the current state of tools and access to data and the unmet patient need, that as these ideas sort of formulated with my co-founder, Jarrett Revels, who's software engineer extraordinaire, and really became clear there was no other path for what I could do and what we could do. This was just a huge opportunity in front of us, and that we had the ability to potentially impact millions of patients. And so for us, it sort of evolved that this was the track we were on, and we had to do it.
Yeah, we hear that a lot from entrepreneurs. Once you identify a problem and you think you've got a solution, it's sort of a little irresistible.
That's right.
Despite the apprehensions about getting into business. So as we wrap up, is there anything else you want to share with us about yourself or Beacon Biosignals before we let you go?
Yeah, I think it's been a pleasure getting some time to speak to you. Obviously, I think I'd love your listeners to keep digging into neurologic and psychiatric diseases and really understand that there's this huge opportunity we see amongst many others, that we can look back 10, 15 years to what oncology looked like, where really heterogeneous disorders we were often defining by the histology of the slides. We now, we don't think twice that we're getting molecular and genetic profiling to understand what precision therapies to give and cure these patients. I think everyone should be looking forward and thinking about how we can drive that similar narrative and that transformation in neurology and psychiatry, where I think we're really on the cusp.
That's a great note to end on. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Donoghue, for spending time with us today. We wish you the best of luck with Beacon.
Thanks so much.
I'm Michael Carrese. Thanks for checking out today's show. And remember to do your part to raise the line and strengthen the healthcare system. We're all in this together.
If you like this podcast, please share it on your social channels. You can also subscribe to the series and check out all of our episodes at osmosis.org/raisethelines podcast.